Hey class, welcome back. Today we are going to get into Chapter 17, Part 2, and we're going to talk about America's imperialism at the turn of the 20th century. So we're really going to focus on three examples of American imperialism in this lecture. We're going to begin by talking about the supporters of American imperialism, and then we're going to give the three examples, which is the annexation of the island nation of Hawaii, the Spanish-American War, and finally the Filipino American War. So before we begin today, we're going to kind of set up the environment that American imperialism happens in. And it should be noted that European countries had been expanding into sovereign territories throughout the 19th century. So you can see here between 1870 and 1900, European nations will colonize more than 20% of the world's landmass and 10% of the world's population. A lot of this colonization is taking place in places like Africa and also in parts of Asia. So the United States is really looking to Europe as an example for imperialist expansion. And there are a number of reasons why people want to expand the United States influence, and we'll get into those later on. But basically, for now, just understand that this is an example that the United States is following, as European nations had been doing this for quite some time throughout the 19th century. And even before, you could argue, in the Americas. So here's an example of European imperialist expansion, and a really good example is the Berlin Conference of 1885. This is when a group of 7 European nations came together in Berlin, Germany, to basically divide up the entire continent of Africa. So that is the map that you are seeing there. So the countries that divided up Africa were Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Italy, Belgium, and Spain. And you can see by the map that basically every single African nation has been claimed by a European power, with the exception of only 2. One is right here, Ethiopia, and the other is right here, Liberia. Now, the reasons why these 2 areas were spared was Ethiopia defended itself. So it was able to successfully fight off a European nation. And then over here, Liberia, the European countries thought that perhaps the United States would have a vested interest in Liberia because there had been a Back to Africa movement back in the early 1800s that the United States had been involved in. So the European nations left this open for possible colonization by the United States. But you can see it's quite remarkable that all other parts of Africa are going to be claimed by European powers. And you can see here the real quote-unquote winners of this division of Africa are really France here in the dark blue, and then Britain here in this hot pink color. So basically you've got these European nations coming together. There's no Africans present at this conference, and they're basically saying, let's divide up this continent. Now, they did this in an effort to avoid wars over colonization, right? They wanted to ensure that this would sort of be a peaceful division of the continent. Africa, of course, is extremely rich in resources, and so that was the primary motivation, was an economic motivation. Okay, so now we're going to start talking about some of the promoters, supporters of American imperialism. Why did the United States expand aggressively into the Pacific region? Well, there were 3 groups that were really promoting this expansion. And we're going to talk about those three groups right now, beginning with the Protestant missionaries. So Protestant missionaries from the United States had been going out into the Pacific region dating all the way back to the early 1800s. They were going on missionary missions to places like Hawaii, to places in Asia. And basically what they're doing is they're laying down this sort of cultural foundation for later imperialist expansion. So a perfect example of this is in Hawaii. So in the early 1800s, missionaries come to Hawaii, and there are Native Hawaiians, of course, living there. And these American missionaries are able to establish themselves there on the islands. They typically come as family units, so they have kids, but also at the same time they are converting the Native Hawaiians to Christianity. And this also includes the royal Hawaiian family. And that will end up sort of planting the seeds for later conquest of the Hawaiian Islands, which we will talk about when we talk about Queen Liliuokalani. So Protestant missionaries are kind of on the front lines of creating this cultural transformation in these regions that lay the foundation for later imperialist expansion. So Protestant missionaries, one of the supporters of American imperialism. Second, you have business interests. And this, of course, I think is pretty self-explanatory. But as we get into the 1890s, there is an economic depression that takes place in 1893. And so people are looking to other parts of the world to try to open up markets, to try to find other places to sell American goods. So there were a lot of goods that America produced that were desired in other parts of the world. Things like Kodak film, or Singer sewing machines, or Standard Oil, tobacco, American tobacco, American wheat and flour, right? So all of these things could be sold in other parts of the world. And if the United States had a strong relationship with these other parts of the world through imperialist expansion, then they would have favorable trading relationships. So there was a strong business element to this, right? Let's find places to make money. Finally, you have the imperialists. And the imperialists wanted to see the United States as a global power. Keep in mind that at this point in history, at the turn of the 20th century, the United States is not really seen as a global power. The global power center is in Europe. And so the United States wants to see that global power center shift to the US. And so they have a motivation for, the imperialists have a motivation for wanting to expand the US economic presence, but also military presence across the globe. And it made sense for the US to look towards the Pacific to make that happen, since the Europeans had already focused and basically gobbled up most of Africa and also parts of Asia. So it made sense for, and India. So it made sense for the US to look towards the Pacific to expand its imperialism. So now we're going to turn our attention to talking about Hawaii and talking about the forced annexation of this island nation by the United States. So as I mentioned before, American Protestant missionaries had traveled to Hawaii in the early 1800s, and they had really established themselves there. And at the same time that the missionaries are establishing themselves, living on the islands, having children, basically buying up land and planting plantations, you also have American whalers and sea people that are coming in and out of the port. And by the time we get to 1875, the United States has established a small naval presence on the island of Oahu at Pearl Harbor. So Pearl Harbor, as a small Navy base for the United States, is established in Hawaii before Hawaii is even part of the United States in 1875. And basically, as what you see is over time, by the time we get to the late 1800s, there starts to be a real tension between the American presence on the islands, which is a military presence and also a business interest presence with the plantation owners, and the Native Hawaiians. And the reason for this is because the Native Hawaiians had a monarchy, and this monarchy wanted to have a certain amount of power and legitimacy, understandably. And you can see here pictured, this is Queen Liliuokalani, and Queen Liliuokalani comes to power at a very contentious time in Hawaii's history. And her brother, King Kalakua, had actually given up the veto power of the monarchy to the Americans in a previous reign. And when she comes to power in 1891, she tries to restore the veto power of the monarchy, meaning she wants to restore some of the political power of this Hawaiian monarchy. And when she does this, the Americans start to panic. And what they do is they basically ignore the fact that she is demanding to have political legitimacy. And in 1893, they turn Hawaii into a U.S. protectorate. And in 1894, the Americans create the Republic of Hawaii, basically completely overriding any of the desires of the monarchy or the Native Hawaiians. And they elected a president of their republic, an American by the name of Sanford Dole, yes, of Dole pineapple, because they had a bunch of plantations there on the islands, and they wanted to protect their economic interests. Well, there were a significant number of Native Hawaiians and Asian workers, plantation workers, that had been brought over to work on the plantations, and of course the monarchy, who protested this conversion as to Hawaii as being a republic. And in 1895, they launched a counter-revolution, which included protests, and it also basically the Americans decide that they are going to crack down on this revolution. In fact, there was a storage of weapons at the base of Diamond Head Crater where that were discovered by the Americans, and Queen Liliuokalani was implicated in this conspiracy or plot to overthrow the Americans, and she's put under house arrest. And she's forced during her house arrest to abdicate the throne and the premise is that it will protect her people, that if she doesn't abdicate, basically give up her power as the queen of Hawaii, that her people will suffer. And this is a forced abdication. And the people who carry out the forced abdication are a group of businessmen, American businessmen, and a small group of Marines from the base at Pearl Harbor. So it is a forced abdication that Queen Liliuokalani endures in 1896. It's a very sad story. When she is finally released from house arrest, she decides that she needs to, step up her protest. And so she makes a trip to Washington, D.C., a very long journey, as you can imagine, on a boat, all the way to the nation's capital to protest the annexation. And she gives a speech in front of the United States Congress where she says that this is a illegal takeover of her country, that she and the Native Hawaiians refuse the power and leadership of the United States. It's a very powerful speech that she gives to the United States Congress. Unfortunately, it is ignored. And the United States Congress votes in the year 1900 to establish Hawaii as a territory of the United States with the passage of the Hawaii Organic Act. And of course, Hawaii will remain a U.S. territory until 1959, when it is admitted as the 50th state in the U.S. So in 1959, Hawaii becomes a state, but it becomes a state under the premise of this forced taking of Hawaii back in 1900 as a territory under the protest of the royal family and of the native Hawaiians. Okay, so now we're going to move forward to talk about another example of American imperialism in the 19th century, and this is the Spanish-American War. So before we talk about the actual war between the United States and Spain, we are going to talk about the origins of the Spanish-American War, which can actually be traced all the way back to the 1860s, when Cuban independence fighters began to rise up against Spain and try to claim their independence from Spain. Now, keep in mind, of course, that Spain had colonized nearly all of Central and South America. And so most of those countries had gained their independence by the time we get to the 1860s. Cuba was one of the last holdouts of the Spanish colonies in the Americas, Cuba and Puerto Rico. And so the Cubans in 1860 began to rise up. They want their independence. And they were consistently put down by the Spanish government. And the Spanish did not want to give up Cuba for one primary reason, and that's that Cuba was a very profitable colony for them, particularly because of the sugar plantations throughout the islands. So in the 1890s, this Cuban independence movement starts to gain momentum, and it gains popular support. And at that point, the Spanish decide that they are going to begin to imprison the Cuban revolutionary leaders, and not just the revolutionary leaders, but anybody that supported Cuban independence would get thrown into these prison camps. And these prison camps were very brutal, very harsh conditions. People were dying of malnutrition, disease, and that type of news starts to leak out to the American press. Now, during this time period, print journalism was king, right? There is no television, there's no radio. Basically, it was newspapers. That's where you got your news. And so newspapers would often compete with each other to try to sensationalize stories in order to get readership, right? Because people wanted to read things that were sensational. They wanted to read things that were interesting. And so there was this hype amongst journalists to try to get readership. And two of the biggest competing newspaper people at the time were William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. And they would compete with each other to try to get readership. And William Randolph Hearst, in particular, when it came to this issue of Cuba, really began to play up the issue of Spain being the bad guy, Spain oppressing the Cuban people. And he starts to kind of get the American public to try to care about the Cuban people in their fight for independence. He also has some ulterior motives here. William Randolph Hearst was also a businessman and saw the benefits of potentially having some American influence in Cuba and having American ability to invest in Cuban sugar and that type of thing. So there was a whole group of businessmen and politicians that saw a motivation for supporting the Cubans in their fight against Spain in order for America to have more influence in Cuba. So we can see here in 1896, this is a souvenir from the Cuban American Fair at Madison Square Garden in New York City, and you can see that it is a celebration of the Cuban revolutionaries. And the person that you see pictured in the center there is Jose Marti. He is considered the father of the Cuban revolutionary movement. He will die in 1895 and become kind of a martyr for the cause of Cuban independence. So we can see the fact that the United States is holding this Cuban American Fair at Madison Square Garden, again, trying to forge this relationship between the United States and these Cuban revolutionaries. Here you can also see an example of what was called yellow journalism. This was because of the paper that the stories were printed on and the cartoons were printed on. As you can see, this paper, this cartoon is a little bit yellowish. And basically, this is a political cartoon that shows Uncle Sam chopping down the Spanish colonies, and you can see Spain depicted as kind of an old, frail man holding on to its last little bit of colonies. And so there was this real push to try to promote getting rid of Spain from the Western Hemisphere. So President McKinley, who you see pictured there, was at first very hesitant to get involved in this conflict between the Cuban revolutionaries and the Spanish government. The reason for this is that the United States, with the exception of Hawaii, had not really gotten involved in any other country's affairs up until that point. The United States was not in the business of going around and policing the world and standing up for people's rights, as we often do today. So the United States' role at this point after the Spanish-American War is really going to change in significant ways. So he's trying to resist this war with Spain, but there is a lot of pressure within his administration, and particularly from his Secretary of Navy, Theodore Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt decides that he is going to go ahead and ready the Navy for a potential conflict with Spain. And he actually orders the Commodore to set out and head out for the port at Manila in the Philippines, because the Philippines was also another Spanish colony. So Roosevelt knows if we go to war with Spain, we're going to have to also go to war in the Philippines. So he decides to ready the Navy. He sends the naval fleet towards the Pacific Fleet, towards the Manila harbor. At the same time, President McKinley decides that he is going to send a U.S. battleship down to the Havana harbor. And again, this is not an act of war necessarily, but it is just simply a gesture. Hey, we are here. We're watching you, Spain. We don't agree with the way that you're treating your people. And the USS Maine is moored in the Havana harbor for 6 days, and then all of a sudden it very violently and suddenly explodes. Over 200 U.S. crewmen are killed in this explosion, and it is thought immediately that Spain is responsible for the explosion and destruction of the Maine. And here now McKinley has a reason to begin to mobilize forces against Spain. And that's exactly what he does. When he does this, Spain declares war on the United States, and in response, the United States declares war on Spain. So in April of 1898, the U.S. will go to war with Spain, thereby beginning the Spanish-American War. So here you have a lithograph showing the explosion of the Maine, and the explosion of the Maine really becomes the primary impetus for starting the Spanish-American War. If you click on this YouTube link here at the bottom, it will give you a very good, about 7-minute video summary of the Spanish-American War. So here you have a map that shows the U.S. military strategy in the Caribbean during the Spanish-American War. You can see here, let me get my laser pointer. You can see here that here is a naval blockade that the U.S. is putting up in order to prevent Spanish ships from entering into the Caribbean Sea. You'll notice here that most of the fighting is happening here in Santiago, out in Cuba, and over here in Puerto Rico, there is no fighting, although at the very end, towards the end of the war, the U.S. it does send troops over to Puerto Rico, but it is unnecessary for there to be any fighting because ultimately there will be a treaty signed with Spain. If you clicked on the video and listened to it, you would have found out that U.S. forces were suffering significantly during the Spanish-American War. The American military was totally unprepared for a war, particularly in tropical climates. Soldiers were deployed in woolen uniforms. There wasn't enough food to feed everybody. It was a really horrific situation. Most of the troops were being deployed from Florida, again, to Cuba, and again, this is where the concentration of fighting took place. Theodore Roosevelt, who you see pictured here, decides that he is going to resign as the Secretary of Navy and fight in the Spanish-American War, since he really promoted this war and wanted it. And so he heads up a group of cavalry called the Rough Riders, who you see pictured here. And they will fight at the battles of San Juan and Kettle Hill and be victorious against the Spanish. And it's considered two of the most critical battles of the war, besides the attack at Manila Harbor in the Philippines. Also at the Battle of San Juan and Kettle Hill are the 9th and 10th Cavalry, a segregated African American cavalry regiment that got very little notice at the time that this battle took place. In fact, the Rough Riders basically got full recognition of this battle, but the 9th and 10th served as well and fought just as hard. So the Secretary of State at the time of this war called this a splendid little war because this war lasted just 4 months long. It was fought in Cuba, and it was also fought in the Philippines. The United States secured an easy victory in this war. A lot of that had to do with its naval supremacy. Not only in the Philippines, where it was able to very easily kind of subdue Manila Harbor, but also in the Caribbean with the naval blockade. Over 5,000 troops will die in this war, but most of them are going to die from disease and malnutrition. Only 300 plus die from actual combat in this war. So that really tells you something about the preparedness of the military forces at the time. Theodore Roosevelt is going to emerge from this war as a war hero. He actually writes a book about his exploits in the Spanish-American War, and it's important because he will become a national figure at this point, and eventually he will become the vice presidential candidate in the 1900 election. So the Spanish-American War, the splendid little 4-month war in 1898, is important for this primary reason: the outcome of the war. The outcome of the war is extremely significant for the United States. The outcome of the war is the Treaty of Paris of 1898. Now, what does the Treaty of Paris say? The Treaty of Paris, in this treaty, Spain will relinquish all of its power over Cuba. So basically Spain relinquishes Cuba as a colony. Spain will also cede Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. So the United States is going to gain territorial control over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The United States will have to pay $20 million to Spain for the Philippines because the Spanish did not want to give up the Philippines. And we'll talk about why that is in a minute when we talk about the American Filipino War. But Spain relinquishes its power over Cuba, but the United States still wanted to have some influence in Cuban political and economic affairs. After all, Cuba is only 90 miles off the coast of the United States, and it was an extremely profitable, resource-rich area. So that is what we are going to talk about next. But before we move on, just know that the importance of the Spanish-American War is the Treaty of Paris of 1898 and the fact that the United States is going to gain territories in Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. And in addition to that, it will gain a certain amount of control over Cuba. And that control is going to be gained through the Platt Amendment of 1901. So the Platt Amendment of 1901 is an amendment to the Cuban Constitution that allows for the United States to have significant control in Cuban affairs. So the Platt Amendment says Cuba could make no treaties with foreign powers on its own. In other words, the United States would help negotiate any kind of agreement that it had with foreign powers moving forward. Secondly, the United States would have broad power to intervene in Cuba's economic and political affairs. Under the Platt Amendment, the United States becomes what's called a favored nation in Cuba, meaning that the United States would be able to have very profitable and beneficial trading partnerships with Cuba. The United States and business interests in the United States would have broad ability to go into Cuba and invest in Cuban sugar companies, plantations, etc. So the U.S. is going to move into Cuba, take over control of a lot of the plantations in Cuba, also take over the tourism industry in Cuba, building hotels and casinos and other types of things moving forward. And then finally, the Platt Amendment allowed for Cuba to sell or lease land in the United States for naval stations. This goes to the strategic position of Cuba in the Caribbean and the fact that the United States is trying to expand its military influence. We still have one of those naval stations, of course, it's Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay is a naval station that we still have in Cuba, despite the fact that Fidel Castro tried to kick the United States out of Cuba. The United States managed to hold on to Guantanamo Bay. Okay, so the final thing we are going to talk about today, the final example, I should say, of American imperialism that we're going to talk about today is the Filipino American War. And why did the U.S. want control of the Philippines? Well, you'll notice here on the map, this is the Philippines, and you can see here the Philippines is a very strategic location in Asia. If you have control over the Philippines, you have very close access to markets in China, Japan, and also Indonesia. So it's extremely strategic. It's the reason why the Spanish had basically taken it in the 1500s as a colony, and then the U.S. will acquire it after the Spanish-American War. So originally, the Filipinos who lived in the Philippines supported the Americans in fighting the Spanish. Why? Because the Filipinos also had an independence movement in which they wanted independence from Spain. But once the United States won the Spanish-American War, they were unwilling to give up the Philippines and allow them to have independence. A lot of the American imperialists would say that the Filipinos were unsuited for self-government. And that was not true, but it was this sort of imperialist superiority mentality that the United States carried with it. Against colonized people around the globe, including the Puerto Ricans. The same argument was given for the Puerto Ricans after the Spanish-American War. So the U.S. justified their presence and their colonization, not colonization, but territorial control of the Philippines by this idea that the Filipinos were somehow unfit for self-rule. This really upset the Filipino independence fighters, including Emiliano Aguinaldo, who you see pictured here. Emiliano Aguinaldo had been fighting for quite some time against the Spanish for Filipino independence, and he had supported, along with his fellow fighters, the Americans in the Spanish-American War. But once the Treaty of Paris of 1898 was signed, he realized right away the Americans don't want to let us have our independence. In fact, the Americans simply want us as a territory. So the Filipino resistance movement rises up and forms a resistance against the Americans. And I've read documents that describe this moment where all of a sudden, Filipino fighters and American fighters that had been fighting side by side in the Spanish-American War begin to turn on each other. And there's this really uncomfortableness where the Filipinos begin to retreat out of Manila, and they're preparing basically to fight against the Americans. And so begins the American-Filipino War, which will be a much longer war than the Spanish-American War, beginning in 1899 and lasting until 1902, and then there will be some continued fighting after that until 1913. The simple reason why the American-Filipino War happened was because of the signing and ratification of the Treaty of Paris of 1898. The Filipino independence fighters felt betrayed by this treaty. They felt as if they had helped the Americans fight back the Spanish, and they were expecting their independence after the Spanish-American War, and they did not get it. Now, the United States will send troops. There was already troops in the Philippines, but they will send troop reinforcements to the Philippines to fight in the Spanish-American War. And the way in which fighting ends up unfolding in the Philippines is extremely brutal. The Filipinos were accustomed to fighting. They had been fighting back the Spanish and fighting for their independence for quite some time. And so they fought in a way that was basically guerrilla-style fighting, right? They understood the landscape. They were able to lay traps. They were able to fight very effectively. The Americans, on the other hand, were woefully underprepared to fight in a tropical environment. And so what ends up happening is the American soldiers in the Filipino-American War basically fight very brutally. They destroy entire villages. They take prisoners of war in which they are torturing these prisoners of war. And to the point where basically their actions, the United States actions in the American-Filipino War, is basically indistinguishable from Spain's actions in Cuba against the Cuban independence fighters in Cuba. So it becomes sort of this irony that the United States had fought to free the Cubans from the Spanish, but then they go over to the Philippines and they act basically the same way towards the Filipinos that the Spanish were acting towards the Cubans prior to the Spanish-American War. After 3 years of fighting, 4,200 Americans will die in the American-Filipino War, and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Filipinos die as a result of the violent attacks on villages and the indiscriminate killing of Filipinos by Americans in this war. The United States will gain a foothold after 1902, but as I mentioned before, there will still be a bunch of rebel groups that will rise up. There's a rebellion called the Moro Rebellion, which will be played out all the way till 1913. The Philippines will remain an American colony until 1946. So as I mentioned before, the United States actions in the Philippines were very brutal and they were heavily criticized. And this is a pretty remarkable photograph that we see here. This is basically a Filipino prisoner of war being waterboarded, tortured by having water poured down his esophagus, gives the sensation of drowning. Obviously, the American soldiers here were trying to probably get some information from this soldier, but again, it's photographic evidence of the brutality of the types of methods that were used in the American-Filipino War. So by the end of all of this, the United States has expanded its influence in the Pacific significantly. You will see here the U.S. strategic holdings in the Pacific by 1900. So of course we have Hawaii, and then also the Midway Islands. These were some uninhabited islands that the U.S. took in 1867. Wake Island in 1899, also in 1899, America Samoa, Guam as a result of the Treaty of Paris, and the Philippine Islands also as a result of the Treaty of Paris in 1898. The point is that the U.S. now has these stepping stones, these strategic military locations throughout the Pacific that lead them to Asia by 1900. So not everybody in the United States was a fan of American imperialism. The Treaty of Paris of 1898 barely passed the U.S. Senate. There were a lot of people that thought that the United States, by its actions, with the annexation of Hawaii, with the Spanish-American War, with the American-Filipino War, were basically becoming indistinguishable from the actions of Europeans. And people were opposed to this, and there were some very famous people that were opposed to American imperialist expansion. People like Mark Twain, the famous writer, presidents like Grover Cleveland, people like Andrew Carnegie, the industrialist. There were labor leaders that were opposed to this, like Samuel Gompers, the head of the AFL. So this is a famous quote from Mark Twain commenting on American imperialism. And he says, "The United States has become yet another civilized power, with its banner as the Prince of Peace in one hand and its loot basket and butcher knife in the other." Basically making the commentary that that the disguise of being the Prince of Peace, right, or bringing and spreading peace and democracy, is secretly hiding the hidden agendas, right, of taking advantage of resources of these areas. So, not everybody in the U.S. was a fan of imperialism, but a narrow majority will pass the Treaty of Paris, thereby acquiring Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, and then also setting the stage for the U.S. to have the Platt Amendment into the Cuban Constitution so that it has incredible powers, economic and political powers in Cuba moving forward. And finally, we'll end with this cartoon from 1898, where you can see the United States depicted there with as the bald eagle with its wings spanning across the Caribbean to Puerto Rico, and then all the way over across the Pacific to the Philippines. So that concludes chapter 17. Please let me know if you have any questions. You can send me an email or you can Zoom into office hours. Thanks. Have a good one.